Very occasionally I see a wedgie. So as kids we always knew that we had to connect with this part of the world. My own grandparents, my mother's side, they lived in Brunswick, but she'd been left a house in Malden by an aunt, and the various branches of us cousins and us kids, the Romerils, the Swansons and so on, we'd go up there and give the grandparents trouble during the school holidays. So I got into my body and brain that central Victorian skyscapes and things of that sort. And it became pretty natural for me when I figured, hang on, I can work. I began work as a writer, and I was attached to the Pram factory in Melbourne and got a start really at La Mama. But I figured, hang on, I can work from home. I can work anywhere really, and so I used to shuttle to and fro between a place that we'd bought as a bit of a weekender in Golden Point, just on the road towards the reservoir.
So you said you were studying Bachelor of the Arts. You wrote your first play while you were there?
Yeah. I wrote my first play really for a group, largely that protest period, the anti-war period. But I was writing a novel when I was living on the farm in New Zealand. And when I came back, here were a number of students and so on, and the anti-conscription movement was cooking. And I had long hair, and I knocked on the family house, and my mum took one look at me and said, "You're not staying here, he'll kill you." so off I went and hooked up with some old mates, and we were living in a share house in Windsor. And then I resumed my studies at Monash. And yeah, I wrote, first I wrote stories and poetry, did a bit of sketching and painting and that sort of thing.
Did you know what you wanted to do then? Did you know you wanted to be a writer or a playwright even? Did you know?
Well, the possibility of turning it into a profession or a living only dawned on me. I just wrote we hanging around La Mama and so on. There was a band there, so I was writing lyrics for them and with them. Seemed a natural thing to do, and so on and so forth. So on and so forth. I keep saying so on and so forth. But that's where it developed from. And then television, I got a couple of chances to do because people at e.g. ABC or ABC TV and so on were already aware that there were a few writers associated with La Mama. We'd also made a few student films, and Nigel Buste had made a film or two. Arnie Zabel was kicking around, and the TV execs, at least at ABC, took an interest in the new Australian writing for the stage. So yeah, it was great apprenticeship. And when I came back from New Zealand, I more or less ran slap bang into a large cohort who were using La Mama as a bit of a base, and Jack Hibbard was one of the writers. I became one of the writers. We were working with they who would go on to become skyhooks and so on were hanging around. So the 60s into the 70s was a real compass setting for me. I could work out by stitching together a bit of TV, get the odd film thing, keep going on the plays, and that was it. And I've not stopped.
What I read recently, you've written 80 plays. Is that correct, or is there more than that?
Yeah, I'll check out the shelf in a minute. But at least, yeah. I mean, it was. I suppose in some ways it might have even reflected my old man. The daily grind of pumping out music for a living. I'd learnt to just go for it, and a lot of those short, a sketch for a street demo, a one-act play for here or there, but 74. Or with the advent of when we started to take ourselves seriously and moved from La Mama into the Pram Factory in Drummond Street and turned the panel beaters, and the building itself had an interesting thing, but it had been an old livery stable, so downstairs was where the horses were kept, and that parlayed into panel beaters in our time. But upstairs had been a dance hall, a cocaine den. It had been a boxing thing, Carlton boxing ring and spectators for that and so on. So it had quite a checkered history, and we just moved in and built a new theatre there. And it gave us two spaces, a small theatre out the back that held about 60, 70 people, and then a 250-seater in the front. And everyone pitched in, and later, I mean, we became a home too for Circus Oz. Circus Oz in many ways evolved out of cross-fertilisation of some circus devotees in Adelaide fusing with the circus people in our ranks. And a lot of we had in-house, welders and people, good mechanical people. And the first tent for Circus Oz was made in our workshop. Yeah, I mean, there was a project developer called Brian Parsons, who had a bit of ground out Chewton Way, and that he also the same real estate agent, Felix Cappy, had access to this patch of 250 acres here, and Felix brought me out, showed it to me. There's a pipeline, the old Malden water supply that runs from Barker's Creek. It consists of lengths of American cedar bound in wire, and water was gravity fed through that pipeline to Malden years ago, and that's one of the tracks here. But I spotted the ground because, like I say, we'd had a taste of life in Chewton, went back to North Fitzroy, the kids went to Princess Hill and local state schools there. We'd sold up the Chewton experiment, and I was still anxious to continue living here or look forward to living here or have a weekend or whatever. And this whole joint was up for sale, 250 acres. I wanted 30k or something. And so I scrabbled around and got 10 shareholders. And the title was Tenants in Common, as it had always been, I think. And hence 10 people have shares in 250 acres, so they can walk anywhere, do anything they choose. And because it's also on 3 titles plus a road easement and so on, we're able to build a number of dwellings. And Paul built, I built, Bruce Spence built, Folly built, and others just visit from time to time, are happy with that. I mean, it was cheap enough in the beginning. They have access to it when and if they want. And a certain number of us have opted to live in. So I built this place with 3 mates, 4 actually. Tony Cook, Dick Anderson, David Wallace, and that was it, yeah. Oh, Johnny Pace. They were just bush builders. Again, people who'd been a bit influenced by the mud brick movement in Warrandyte. And I thought I'd give that a go. A lot of the timbers, the poles are ex-electricity poles. The flooring that I've used as cladding was from a factory in North Fitzroy, a boot factory. So it was full of gunk and glue and oil and stuff from that. So it's really good Tassie oak. And I just went on the scrounge. I was for building materials. The iron I got as a good deal. It's heavy gauge. And a guy who sold it to me said, you've got a bargain there, pal. And I of course thought, oh yeah, what's he talking about? It's just corrugated iron sheets, but it's actually really heavy grade. So I lucked it there. There's a lot of beams and those windows are out of North Wharf. And you see the same at various hippie places around, because I just got maybe 60 of them. And some mates used them in their houses, and you'll see a few dwellings around Castlemaine that feature those. Unless you replace the glass, because they're at North Wharf, there is some spray-induced wear and tear on the panes. And it's okay when I break a pane, I do get a new one. And gradually, I suppose, over the years, I may be able to see past the salt. But and I suppose I've always, because of the tech school background, I was no hassle. I felt easy around tools or whatever, so I didn't feel too faced by building, and that was that.
What's the best thing about living here?
The solitude. How is other people, especially directors? But people who I just find the amount of sustained, concentrated time one needs to give, or I need to give, the act of writing is most easily accomplished by the fewest interruptions possible. So get out of here, you lot. But you're stopping me writing. But that's its chief.
Yes, you need long, uninterrupted time.
Yeah.
What about wildlife?
Absolutely. That I love.
Yeah.
I love, I collect water. I haven't had a water bill or an electricity bill for 30 or 40 years. So cool. Castlemaine had always in its way been a metropolitan kind of event, as the goldfields had. I mean, people from all over the world were washed up here. You can see it in certain of the names and so on that linger on even today. When I started playing cricket for Harcourt, you know, there were the Jervisonis and things of that sort. And the local bourbois sausage is, of course, a Swiss recipe, and so on. So, and Thompson's. I mean, Thompson's was one of the great foundries. I saw one of the dishes that was destined for Parks being transported out there, so you have a mix of not just rural hillbillies or something. You have people who are actually into, e.g., even breeding certain forms of sheep or cattle or pig. They're gifted agricultural folk who also have to think wider than just the vicinity. Thompson's was working lots of... they thought they were going to be in clover in the 50s because they're a pumping mob. Nuclear power, pumps, absolutely required. So they were looking forward to that. I guess doing the dishes at Parks sort of... but there are a lot of trained people here. Skilled artisans, skilled mechanics, the whole trip. I mean, not for nothing is it called the hot rod centre of the world. It's that because there are a lot of rev heads. And so good tradesmen and so on. And I joined the ALP here, so I got to know a lot of those folk. Ray Bradfield was a part of that. Went on to become a local historian, but he was very across the history of the place, and it had always, and now with the baker, the carpet factory. It employed artisans, and so it wasn't a hick town by any means. And there were certain levels of patronage here too, like Stuart Stoneman, who really invented the first supermarket. I mean, he ripped it off from the States, but he basically ran the first, or established the first supermarket, not in Castlemaine, in Australia. And so people often travelled, came back with ideas, didn't apply them in Castlemaine.
So it was a place of ideas.
Because the skill base is there, let alone teachers coming and going. The high school, the Catholic schools, the other school, and so on and so forth. But there was a really big blue collar workforce, and drafts people, people who can work from a very complex plan. People underrate. I'm saying this as an ex-tech school boy, but the amount of the fusion of hand and brain tasks that are part and parcel of how we produce things.
I'm just wondering about then how you connected with the artists that you knew and associated with when they first started exhibiting together and held the Quarry Show and the Rock Hoppers Opera.
Well, there are a number of people who had similar ideas at the time, I guess, but there were people who had come from Eltham and had that model of the joint out there, the Jurgensen place, Montsalvat, and there was another anti-conscriptionist who'd been a television personality, Clive Willman. He escaped Melbourne and escaped conscription, I think, by disappearing into the forest above Chewton. So there were a number of people who were figuring, let alone pre-existing artists and so on, but it was making sense to a lot of people to maybe priced out of the housing market in Melbourne, or who artisans, leather workers, potters and so on. There was a bit of a crew that had either predated or come after I was here. Lynn and Laurie Turner were old RMIT trained in artists who figured they could live cheaply.
So tell me the feeling of in 1980 when the Quarry Show happened.
In a way, it was no surprise, in as much as we were used to doing outdoor work in the protest days and so on. And we'd also established a bit of a factory circuit at the Pram factory. So the idea of doing shows and stuff in nature was not the surprise, but how that quarry came up was a real buzz. Just lighting on. I mean, it had mostly been a slate quarry, right? And it just took light, and it also had sonic fidelity of a most tasteful sort.
But this play that you had, well, it was probably more a musical because you wrote a series of songs and you called it The Castlemaine Rock.
Yeah. We got up a bit of a scratch band and did. I mean, there was and I tried to write songs based on local events. There was one immortal one called Forest Creek in Flood, and stuff like that. So yeah, the idea of Castlemaine Rock, given the wonderful local confectionery. And that whole idea of working outdoors, using found spaces. I mean, we found an old livery stable, turned it into a theatre. The theatre that isn't in purpose-built theatres, I still take a great interest in that because it interfaces often with the community or often with passing traffic or whatever, or it's into schools or it's... The theatre is edgy. The theatre that isn't in a theatre is a good example of it. But a certain amount of danger, but also utilising the existing environment, being true to place. There's a lot that art or the theatre can do to exploit an environment. One of the early names for the Pram factory, or for the APG, Australian Performing Group, one that was tossed around was the Environmental Patrol. Fucking glad we didn't go with that one. but it sort of hints at how much work we were trying to do in community, in parks, on the beach, go where people who've maybe a bit edgy about even entering a theatre. We were trying to desacralise the theatre as an act of and performance, and make it a much more common feature of everyday life.
Tell me about content, some of your themes that have been dear to you through your work.
I have a great, I understand the theatre to be that tension between what is and what could happen. There's a great Japanese playwright who wrote 120 plays in the 18th century, and he said the theatre is neither wholly realistic nor wholly fanciful. Rather, it exists in the gap between the two. So that dialectical tension of reality and fantasy, or reality and fancy, is part and parcel of the dramatic moment, as far as I'm concerned. And that quote that I came, because I did time in Japan myself, and I was one of the things that amazed me was how much I understood without knowing even the language, because you sensed what was happening between actors, and so on. It's again that thing, the drama occurs in the air between two actors, or
the relationship between.
Yeah. It's in the gap, and that's why I pause a lot and But what's coming next? It's a very kinetic form, theatre, and a highly physical form. You can tell from I'm saying yes, I'll do that, and my body is saying I fucking hate having to do this. I mean, that bounce. There's a great thing Pinter said about waiters. Whenever they take off their shoes and socks, you see these tortured feet. Because the face is, yes, your soup is coming, and I will take that back for you, yes, and I'll tell cook it's not very... And the feet are going... but I like that thing of the collision of A and B produces C. It gets down to a pretty simple theorem, I suppose. But and in looking at X wants Y wants what they want, Y wants what they want.
Yes, and how
there's a battle of wills, and how we modify each other's behaviour, how we learn to succeed without trashing too many people, or whatever. There's put on displays contention, force A versus force C, B, producing result C, and minute by minute by minute, that is growing, it's breathing, it's the stage is a very live place.
Yes, it is, but there's a story there too that you're telling, and so there's a context of the story. And
So the past's impact on the present is one of the things that I've taken a bit of an interest in, and that was my first key and often the most, or is probably the most famous play that I ever managed to do, but I started that here in Chewton. The travels had widened me to the world, but I'd also seen Asia, and I got interested in the experience of prisoners of war. And that play I wrote in Chewton there was typical of a lot of the experience. People came back and they didn't want to talk about it, especially POWs. I lived opposite an ex-POW in Moorabbin, and he worked at the Laminex factory, and he had a fixed wheel bicycle, and he was good on the bike, and he got to the Laminex factory down there. But to see him walk, he'd take almost 5 minutes to walk across the frontage of his house. So that was in it, and he was in one of the camps. but it got me into basically an ethic or a work ethic that is stuck with me, which is going to life. I think life is far more interesting, variable, wacky than anything you can make up. And so whenever I get, I do a lot of research or I go interview people. It was as simple as coinciding with, there was a women's theatre group that grew up within the Pram Factory. It was the damned whores and God's police sort of moment, the third wave feminism. And so there was a women's theatre group there. And it became part of my practice. Hitherto, I'd probably, if I was writing a police person into a play, I'd immediately assume a man. And I started to unassume a man and say, how would this work if that police person was a police woman? And so on and so forth. So the agitation about, too many male roles, where are the women's? When that is, you grow up.
When you're aware of that.
Yeah. So you start to turn the prism a bit and
would you say that
recognise in your own behaviour how sort of male your immediate impulses are and start to question them and so on.
Would you say that was true of race as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Certainly, there was a time when you did consider and wrote more than one play about, Jack Charles, or his experiences as an Aboriginal man.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Jack's. It just became possible. Suddenly, there was an Aboriginal actor within your circle, nearby, and first Jack Hibbard. Jack wrote Captain Midnight for him, and I wrote Bastardy for him, with him in mind. I mean, I'd always been working with certain Pram Factory actors in mind. You know, Max Gillies, Peter Cummins, Wilfred Last, Kerry Dwyer, Meg Clancy. There was you knew your actors, and you started to work out how to write for them, or you knew what sort of their skill set was and how to utilise it in a script. And that's good lesson. But working, I love nothing better than to know who I'll be, if I'm working on a commission, who will be cast in it, and sometimes that might even be part of the commission. Can you write a show that showcases actor X or Y? But once I know who's cast and so on, I can adjust, adapt, and get inspired myself. Because finally you're writing for people on a stage, how they move, how they look, what their command of language is, how they sound, what their ranges are. You have to be aware of all that stuff, or else it may turn into a dud.
How much do you anticipate your audience and their reaction?
That's the rather wondrous thing. Every night is a different kind of show, but their impact on a play is such a living, breathing thing, and the presence of the audience is such a measure of that. They're living, breathing. They're either in there with it, or they're, what are we doing here? Sort of thing. So you become very attuned and very aware of every night. It ain't the same show. It's always impacted by the real time and real place in which it's being performed. And you may think you're just doing what you did last night, and in many cases you probably are staying faithful to what you and the director hacked out. But it's always in the gap out there between audience and stage, a new contract is being formed.
Can you tell me what you think about this region in terms of its attraction for artists from the 60s on?
Well, I mean, there's, even back to Goldfield days, there's, the photographers of that era. There's quite a photographic record of the life and times in those days. Beric Segan, who runs the Pine Forest and also ran a box factory in Harcourt, was also, as a Jewish refugee, a highly cultured kind of guy and into classical music and so on. And while he was he ran his business here, and so on, he thought a way of giving back to the town would be to kick in for the Castlemaine State Festival has its opening concert, and he in fact sort of was behind a cartel or whatever that bankrolled the arrival of the MSO here, giving a free concert for the people of the town. His workforce lived in and around the area. He was a patron and a driving force, along with Fee Broadway and others, in establishing the Castlemaine State Festival. And it's a damn good festival. And of course it supplies a bit of work for people, I think I had a show on it at the first festival, and I had a show on it at the most recent one, when we did that show in the jail.
The going through.
Yeah, going through. So,
how do you think these people were received by locals when they first started to come with their beards and their hippie ways?
I think, unlike certain country places, Castlemaine always carried its migratory impulse or underlay. It was well recognised that everyone was a migrant, and the influx of people in and out of town of this place occurred in certain waves as well. That the pump factory, but the baker and various other employers. It's not the evidence too of certain food recipes from around the old days. People are, the mix of skills within the town and is already wide, and people's encounters are wide. There's always someone around who can fix something and so on. Amid the hot rod centre of the world, there's great mechanics here. It's a town that the habit of a certain amount of patronage, e.g., is reflected in the gallery. The collection of the town was rich. A lot of people who came here had no problem with there being a gallery. I mean, it's like the Mechanics Institute movement. There's a bit of redneckery, but the curiosity. I mean, I've always objected to that dialectic or that thing being set up. It takes no account of the fact that, for instance, the farming in Australia was highly scientific, great agronomy, tricks with trees, the orcharding district, brewing, all those things. We underestimate how educated or how people took on education as a project. Farming in Australia and agronomy and livestock rearing bloodlines, size of yarn that you're getting off a wool clip. All those things require intelligence. We're a very brainy kind of mob. So in often the same, we had no, I can't recall anything but okay relations with people here. There might have been, bloody hippies or whatever. But soon enough, you fight a fire and he's an okay bloke. In fact, that happened. But it's hardly the war against the old castle maniacs and the new settlers. It's cool.